Hello there, this is James of 1978, and to keep up the tradition of panning at least one film produced by Jason Blum every Halloween, earlier this year I was commissioned to review 3 of the movies released by Blumhouse Productions between last Halloween and today, and all that I can say after watching all 3 movies back to back in a single night is thank the great holy donkey that I was paid, because having effectively predicted everything of consequence about them from, in one case, the trailer, in another, the plot synopsis, and in the third, the title alone before I even watched them, the only positive thing that I have to say about any of the films is that at least they're over now. So if you're the kind of person who can't figure out exactly what's going to happen before you even watch the movie, or who believes that giving away spoilers should be prosecuted as a crime against humanity, then do please consider this a spoiler warning, and also please note that I don't give enough of a flying fig about these films to Google anything about them, so if I do get any of the details wrong, then I honestly don't care about that either. Having hopefully made all of that clear then and established a baseline of dispassionate dismissal and contempt, before I move on to panning each film individually, the one thing that they all have in common is that Blumhouse Productions has fallen back into the bad habit of stretching out concepts that would have been so much more effective as short films that cut straight to the chase into full feature-length movies that drag on for far too long, simply because there's more profit to be had from full theatrical releases. Honestly, having already known what was going to happen and thus simply waiting for them to get to the bloody point, I spent the first 20 minutes or more of each movie dying of boredom and begging for them to get the fuck on with it. Because come on, surely after the first 10 or 15 minutes, even people in comas know what's going to happen next.
Get on with it. Yes, get on with it!
However, at the very least, unlike some of the Blumhouse films that I first reviewed 3 years ago, none of these 3 movies crudely tacked on an obvious extension in their desperate struggle to stretch themselves out to full feature length. But even leaving all of that aside though, and finally moving on to dissect each film individually, Happy Death Day is literally nothing but Groundhog Day with stabbing, full stop, with its lone unique selling point being the murder mystery of the protagonist trying to figure out who keeps killing her, stop them, and thus break the time loop. A plot point which ultimately adds absolutely nothing because instead, just as in Groundhog Day, the movie is entirely focused on the character arc of the protagonist, in this case a stereotypical sorority girl rather than a weatherman, who, having failed to break the loop as their bitter, egocentric selves, have an epiphany, embrace the opportunity that the time loop provides, and learn to stop being so arrogant and self-absorbed, and thus become better people. In this case, however, rather than the romance being at the core of the story, the protagonist basically seems to just decide to stop being promiscuous and to stop having sex with her teacher, instead declaring that she loves the average guy who helps her and that she's, quote, going to have his babies after he saves her life, because Groundhog Day had a love story, so this film has to have one as well. And also, we've got to reassure the hashtag nice guys of the world that they also have a chance with the hypergamist whores as long as they treat all women like one-armed bandits who give love, sex, and or reassurance as long as you keep feeding them enough kindness coins. Seriously, fuck that trope. Beyond that, though, there is also a startling ignorance of tone in this movie, cutting directly from the protagonist's acute psychological trauma as a result of being repeatedly murdered and reliving the same day over and over, knowing that she's going to be murdered again, to a stupid comic relief montage in which she eliminates most of the suspects, usually by being murdered by the real killer as she's surveilling those suspects, in one case in full camouflage and night vision goggles, because that looks funnier. A montage in which, by the way, she sees the hunky fraternity stud who's basically been stalking her watching gay porn, thus proving that he's gay because obviously bi and pansexual men, or even straight men with a fetish for gay porn can't possibly exist, and this is somehow supposed to be A, funny, and B, part of the protagonist's growth as she encourages him to finally be himself.
Fuck you!
So as I say then, in the midst of all of this cliched absurdity, her quest to figure out who is murdering her and thus break the time loop is utterly pointless, especially given the fact that at the end of the film, the writers hang a lampshade on the reality that, yep, this is literally just Groundhog Day with stabbing, by having the average guy declare that her scenario reminds him of that movie, to which she insists that she's never even heard of it, to which of course I want to yell at the screen, woman, even if you'd never actually seen Groundhog Day, the term entered the cultural zeitgeist 25 sodding years ago as a shorthand for time loops, deja vu, or a repetitive existence, and is literally listed as a TV trope because you must have either seen or at the very least heard of Run Lola Run, which was Groundhog Day for the MTV generation, Source Code, which was Run Lola Run plus post 9/11 paranoia, at least 2 episodes of the godforsaken Endless 8 in the melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, the episode of Stargate SG-1 in which they literally reference Groundhog Day, or any one of the other 20 billion uses of the time loop trope in fiction.
The fact is, while the idea of standalone appraisal of art is basically sound, there's always mitigating factors when it comes to how much an audience is presumed to know. Saving Private Ryan doesn't feel the need to explain why the Allies and Nazis are fighting. William Shakespeare's audience, primarily poor and working-class theatergoers, not expected to have had extensive education, if at all, remember, was presumed to have at least heard of the real-life figures, mythological characters, and historical events he incorporated into his plays. Renaissance painters and sculptors generally assumed correctly that patrons would immediately recognize the biblical characters and tableaus they were constantly depicting. And in 2017, I do think it's similarly safe to assume that audiences already know who Batman and Superman are, and who Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne are, and to have expectations and preconceptions as to who they are as characters and how they'll behave. To know that if a lady shows up dressed like an Amazon, it's probably Wonder Woman, that if a green rock is in the vicinity, it's kryptonite and that's bad, that a guy named Lex Luthor is up to no good, maybe even to recognize who at least one of these people is supposed to be. And while it goes without saying that you're probably expected to have seen Man of Steel, or at least know what Man of Steel was if you're watching a sequel to Man of Steel, I would go so far as to say it's not unreasonable to grasp that Dawn of Justice means that this is loading the bases for the Justice League movie going in.
And even if by some bizarre coincidence she's been living under a rock for her entire life, addressing the pedantic non-point which the person who commissioned me to review these movies made about my panning of Rick and Morty, links down as the underbar, just as you don't have to have read Dracula, Moby Dick, or Oliver Twist to know the general themes, plot, messages, morals, and concepts of those novels, because just like Groundhog Day, they are now a part of the cultural zeitgeist. You don't have to have watched the original Doctor Who from the 1960s to understand the comparison that I made in my video, because after all, the entire premise of Rick and Morty, the entire basis of the series, is built upon the assumption that we understand that Rick is a dark parody version of the Doctor, apparently not realizing that there have been times during the last 50 years when the Doctor has been infinitely darker.
Fear me, I've killed hundreds of Time Lords.
Fear me, I've killed all of them.
But getting back to the enraging stupidity and utter impossibility of the protagonist of Happy Death Day claiming that she's never heard of Groundhog Day, and by extension, since she didn't ask, oh, is that a bit like Run Lola Run, or a bit like that anime that people keep talking about, any other fiction in which a time loop mechanic is used, in an age in which everyone with an internet connection has access to the majority of all human knowledge, she literally just had to Google Groundhog Day on her phone and read the synopsis of the movie to know what the guy was talking about, just as I knew that this film was a blatant rip-off of Groundhog Day simply by reading the synopsis.
This is not a viewpoint that's widely shared in my vocation, I'll freely admit, but nonetheless I feel pretty strongly that, just as the advent of home video and cable were instrumental in dispelling the idea of sequels and prequels as inherently lower prospect ventures because access was now more readily available to the preceding installments, the combined factors of 24/7 media access, the continued erasure of borders separating different forms of media and media platforms, and the general ubiquity of access to both mass entertainment and information about basically anything has fundamentally changed the reasonable definition of general knowledge, and thus has also changed the standards of what a given movie can reasonably expect its audience to be at least passingly familiar with. Just the simple fact that you could watch the trailer for Dawn of Justice, read up on the plot synopsis, catch up on thousands of articles about its production, casting, and predictions of the storyline, rewatch Man of Steel, read the original Dark Knight Returns and Death of Superman comic storylines, and also go through the same motions for that one similar-looking Captain America sequel, not only at the same time, but theoretically on the same device.
New rules,
yeah, this is a different world now, it deserves different rules.
However, the fact that they hung this lampshade means that we're not allowed to point it out, because the creators know that they're blatantly ripping off one of the most influential and popular movies of all time, and acknowledge that they're doing so in a snarky manner that completely insults our intelligence, which according to ironic, satirical, postmodern, metatextual hipster lore, renders the movie completely immune to any and all criticism under penalty of, well, actually... Indeed, bearing in mind that the entire reason why lampshade hanging not only exists at all, but is so common that there is a shorthand term for the practice, which is also listed as a TV trope, is precisely because the creators in question know that the audience is going to inevitably spot the massive plot hole, contrivance, or in this case, blatant rip-off, and therefore deliberately draw attention to it, often in an amusing and self-deprecating manner, to literally say, yes, we saw it too, we're fully aware of it, don't at me bro. The only reason why the creators of Happy Death Day included this scene at all is precisely because they knew that the bulk of the audience would immediately realise that they had ripped off Groundhog Day, and therefore, if the infuriatingly narrow-minded apologist who commissioned me to review these films was right, and Groundhog Day was made so long ago, and the time loop trope was so common that only pedantic arseholes like me would ever notice it, let alone point it out, then ironically, the scene would have no reason to exist whatsoever. So when all is said and done then, this self-righteously smug act of ego masturbation, believing itself to be oh so incredibly clever, not merely ripping off Groundhog Day, but rubbing our faces in the fact that they did so in the most postmodernly ironic and metatextually hipster way possible, means that Happy Death Day crossed the line from being disposable, cash-in garbage to me angrily declaring,
in summation, fuck this movie, fuck everyone who made this movie, and if you pay money to watch this movie, fuck you too.
Next up, in Truth or Dare, a demon possesses the game of Truth or Dare being played by a group of young college students, demanding that they reveal their most destructive secrets and perform increasingly dangerous and homicidal dares, and will kill them if they lie, fail the dare, or refuse to play. That's it. That's literally the entire film. As I say then, as long as you know that it's a quote-unquote horror movie, then you can figure out everything you need to know about the film from the title alone. But of course, one scene that I have to mention is the one in which the demon dares the token gay Chinese-American character to steal the gun from his cop father's holster and force him to beg for his life, in response to which, in another perfect example of the truism that at least one person in a horror movie has to be completely irrational and do something utterly stupid or otherwise confounding, or the story couldn't progress, the dad keeps asking things like, what's this going to prove, and will this make you feel better, instead of simply saying the words, please don't kill me, meaning that I was literally laughing throughout that scene as I remembered this scene from The Simpsons.
What is it, boy? Is anything the matter, my son? Talk to me, young man. Say your name? Why should I do that, my lad?
Because I'm Jinx, damn it! Ow! What was that for?
You spoke while you were jinxed, so I get to punch you in the arm. Sorry, it's the law.
However, I must admit that this is one of the only occasions I can recall on which I didn't predict the ending, because the film signposted another far superior ending, like a set of landing lights on an airport runway, specifically that having dared one of the original two survivors from the first group of young college students whose game of Truth or Dare it had possessed to bring another group of people up to the old abandoned mission which it had haunted and trick them into playing the game as well. After their attempt to steal the demon had failed, and everyone except the two BFFs who represent the virgin and the whore, according to the cabin in the woods archetype, were all dead, Olivia, the main protagonist, told Marky to choose Dare because she'd apparently figured out that the demon needs more players, that the reason why it had dared Sam to find more is that it can only exist in this world, or what have you, as long as the game continues, that it can't continue to possess the game if there is only one player in the middle of nowhere, and so therefore it can't kill either of them without condemning itself to limbo. And even if that logic doesn't work for you, then Marky dying and leaving the quote-unquote virgin Olivia as the lone survivor miles from the nearest person who can be possessed, refusing to play anymore, refusing to bring more people into the game, and thus who the demon cannot kill without condemning itself to limbo or what have you, therefore allowing Olivia to keep it trapped or make a deal and thus create the opening for the inevitable sequel, would have been a far more logical and effective ending. Or if you still have to pick holes in that logic, then having never been anything other than a plot contrivance by which to crowbar in the inevitable appearance of the elderly Hispanic woman and her teenage granddaughter, who are apparently contractually obligated to appear in every Blumhouse movie now, as well as to set up the bullshit ending, the creators could just as easily have scrapped the conceit that the only person who could trap the demon was the one who released it in the first place, or merely contrived another way to trap it, because we can all name at least 100 films and episodes of TV shows in which what was supposed to be the only means to eliminate the threat failed, but then the protagonist figured out another way to eliminate it just in the nick of time. But instead, having devoted the bulk of the movie to implicitly or explicitly condemning the two survivors of the original group of players for being selfish enough to let strangers die in order to merely live a little longer until it's their turn again, and in one case in particular, because she committed murder with her own hands, serving up poetic justice to punish them for their selfishness, the film ends with Olivia, who'd originally declared herself to be a noble person who wouldn't allow millions of strangers to die, merely to save her friend, deciding to go with the between you and the world I choose you platitude from the beginning of the movie by uploading a video onto YouTube. How the fuck did she get a Wi-Fi signal in the middle of nowhere? Asking everyone who views the video, truth or dare. Not creating a chain letter to save lives, like in The Ring, but simply bringing them into the game and forcing them to ultimately commit murder or die as well, and not saving herself or Marky either, mind you, but simply giving them both a little more time before they will inevitably die as well, because apparently that's what being BFFs is all about. To which I say, to whoever decided to use this ending when the alternatives that I just laid out were so obvious and so superior in every possible respect.
Fuck you. Fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, fuck you, from the bottom of my heart, fuck you.
Because honestly, the only thing I could personally think of that would be any more stupid and just plain wrong on every possible level, displaying an even greater level of gross ignorance of the fundamentals of storytelling and utter contempt for the audience, would be someone being arrogant, delusional, and or suicidal enough to create a movie in which Superman, the universal symbol of goodness, justice, nobility, virtue, and human potential, kills hundreds, if not thousands of people, including the main villain, with his own hands, simply to defy expectations and send the message that this is not your father's Superman. So thank God that such an unforgivable train wreck has never and will never be made by anyone. Oh wait. And finally, Upgrade, the film which you've already essentially seen if you simply watch the trailer.
As a quadriplegic, it must be frustrating for you, someone who likes to get things done with their hands.
Here's the thing. 4 guys murdered my wife.
Don't you fucking touch her!
If I could find those men, I'd do it.
What if I told you I could offer you something that would enable you to walk again? I call it STEM, a computer chip that has the potential to change everything. It's a new, better brain. Oh my God.
I am STEM, the system operating your body for you.
Can anybody else hear you?
No, only you. May I point something out? In the drone surveillance footage, Sir Brantner, Marine Corps, address 414 Citrus, Newgrounds. You'll need a plan.
I got this.
This doesn't seem like a well-thought-out plan. I need your permission to operate independently.
Permission granted!
Thank you.
Stay down, man.
Sam, he's got a knife!
I see that. We have a knife too.
Because in my ever so humble opinion, just as the development of the game Horizon Zero Dawn started with the premise of, wouldn't it be cool to see the princess from Brave fight robot dinosaurs with a bow and arrow, with the developers then reverse engineering a plot to contrive scenarios in which that would make any kind of logical sense whatsoever, the entire point and premise of Upgrade seems to have been to create those stupid Matrix but with slapstick fight scenes, such as the one that you just saw, a buddy cop partnership between the protagonist and the computer chip in his neck, such as the one between Jaime Reyes and his scarab in the second season of Young Justice, and another comical scene in which the protagonist gradually loses control of his body as the stereotypical tech nerd who created the computer chip tries to shut it down, leaving him paralyzed once again. After all, since I realised it immediately, I hope I'm not spoiling the film when I point out that paralysing the protagonist so that he'd accept the computer chip was the entire point and purpose of the attack, rendering the section of the film in which he's depressed and attempts suicide before being offered the computer chip literally nothing but filler, and meaning that ultimately the only reason why his wife was murdered was that without a murder mystery and quest for revenge, there would have been no story. So instead of sending mercenaries to paralyse him, why not simply pay off paramedics to make it look as if he was paralysed in the car crash? Because once again, there wouldn't have been a story, or at the very least, any excuse for cool fight scenes with cybernetically enhanced mercenaries. But the sentient/sapiens computer chip STEM needed to put the protagonist under great emotional and psychological stress in order to... No, it didn't. Because being fiction, the only limits and motivations that exist are the ones that the creators impose. In this case, creating another bullshit contrivance without which, once again, there is no story, with the bottom line being that just as the creators of Truth or Dare threw the entire message and moral of the movie up until that point into a fire, because I've got a shock twist ending now, shock twist endings are cool, every contrivance in this movie exists because without it, there wouldn't be a movie. And while it's certainly true that all fiction is based upon contrivances to a certain extent, that as Alfred Hitchcock once famously stated, the reason why the protagonists don't simply go to the police is because it would be boring, Upgrade takes the abuse of contrivances in its struggle to string together scenes and revelations that the creators merely thought would be cool to a whole other level, and in doing so abandons any pretense of being taken seriously if you stop to think about the film for 5 seconds. For example, the final denouement in which it is revealed, spoiler alert, that the sentient/sapiens computer chip STEM had been the mastermind all along, who had long since taken control of the stereotypical tech nerd's company and orchestrated the attack that paralysed the protagonist because it wanted him as his human body. One of the main plot points in Act 2 is that STEM has input guards, or whatever they're called, which prevent it from doing anything without the permission of the human in question. So how could it have taken over the stereotypical tech nerd's company or compelled him to do anything before those input guards, or once again, whatever they were called, were removed by a hacker? And speaking of which, why did the stereotypical tech nerd wait until STEM was in a human body and within dragging distance of a hacker who could remove the input guards to try and shut it down?
And what was with the jar of Lex Luthor's piss, right? What was going on there? And did Luthor know Batman was going to hijack his kryptonite? Like, was that part of the master plan? It's not really clear in the movie, but it would kind of have to be, because Luthor already had access to kryptonite to experiment on Zod's body and make his anti-Superman monster, so why does he need to work so much harder to get more of it? Plus, he's the one manipulating Batman into fighting Superman in the first place, so he'd have to know that the only way that plan made sense would be if he arranged for Batman to have kryptonite so he'd stand a chance, but how could he possibly know that his vague series of barely connected moves and counter-moves would result in that exact scenario playing out that exact way, and why even bother with Bruce Wayne at all when he's just going to sick doomsday on everyone anyway, and
My ridiculously circuitous plan is 1/4 complete.
Because once again, we wouldn't have been able to use the cool scenes that we thought were fun when we made them up in our heads, so stop ruining the movie by thinking about it, you bastard, and feel awestruck by this dark gotcha ending that we blatantly ripped off from the movie Brazil. In conclusion then, summarising my opinion of all 3 films and of Blumhouse Productions as a whole,
Banks to enlightenment have arrived on the derelict. Confirm initial speculation. There is absolutely nothing of any value or interest here.
As I've already suggested, of course, commissions are always open, so if you have a specific request, then do please email me at the link listed down as your bar, and assuming that I'm interested, I'm certain that we can negotiate a deal. Or if you'd like to join the top tier of my Patreon account, also linked below, then your reward will be the freedom to demand one video from me on any subject every month, which YouTube will allow me to upload and that won't get my account flagged or terminated, obviously. But even if you can't or don't want to join the top tier, all support on Patreon is still deeply appreciated, and if a one-off donation is more your style, then clicking on my tip jar, also known as my paypal.me button, also linked below, will also help me to continue living in the style to which I've become accustomed.